Welcome to Living Outside the Matrix, the show where we explode the many modern myths within the mainstream narrative. Hi there, I'm your host, Nigel Howitt, and on the show today, it's a great pleasure to welcome Mark Devlin. Mark is a fellow truth seeker. He's a DJ and a radio and club DJ, as I say, music journalist, and he's written a couple of books, Musical Truth and its sequel, Musical Truth Volume 2. Mark, thank you very much for joining us today, mate, and welcome to the show.
Well, thanks, Nigel. I used to be a club DJ in the days when we were allowed in clubs. Remember those days? The before times.
I remember. Mark, maybe you can introduce yourself to those people that don't know you. Just give us a little bit about your backstory of how you, you're obviously a musician, music enthusiast, DJ, and so forth. What got you into the sort of truth-seeking scene?
Well, I'll give you the abridged version. So, yeah, I was a club and radio DJ and music journalist. That was my background. And I got started in 1990. And by the time I got to 2010, I've been in the game for 20 years. And by that point, I'd started to ask some questions about what was really going on in the world. Around about 2007, 2008, I started addressing some of these big questions. I was looking around me and I was realizing that the world was very unjust. It didn't seem to make a lot of sense. Common sense was sorely lacking. And there are lots of things that were going on. Governments didn't seem to be acting in the interests of the people that they're supposed to represent. So this set me off down a path of truth seeking. And it all kind of came together for me in 2010 when I was reading a copy of David Icke's book, Human Race Get Off Your Knees, The Lion Sleeps No More. And I was on a trip to New York. I was visiting Buffalo and Niagara Falls as well. So I had a bit of time on my hands on the plane and in airport lounges and such to really devour this book. And it felt as if everything came together in my mind at that point. And suddenly I was getting answers to all the questions that I'd been posing. And I started to see the world and this reality and my place in it and our true nature in a completely different way to what I had before. And it really changed my world. And I'm sure this is a process that will be familiar to many people listening to this. So I've been on this path for 10 years now. And to start with, I only looked at the work of David Icke, which is not a healthy thing to do, just to stick to one researcher. So gradually, I branched out and I started looking at the work of other authors, researchers, filmmakers, radio show hosts and such. And here we are 10 years later, and I've absorbed a huge wealth of information. My life now is completely different to what it was before 2010. I actually have difficulty remembering how I saw the world and how I thought back in 2010. And I have to keep trying to pull myself back into that mind state to understand the way that regular people now are viewing the world in the midst of all this madness we're experiencing, because the likes of us view this situation in a certain way. We realize there are lies and deception everywhere, and we're never told the truth by governments or the mainstream media. But I have to keep reminding myself that the vast majority of people in this world have not figured this out yet. They're still living under mind control. They've been socially conditioned to believe certain things, and we can lose patience with them. I certainly do regularly. But we have to remember that these people have not undergone the experience that the likes of us have, which I refer to as a conscious awakening. And this is the big problem. For as long as the majority of people are still under societal mind control, then all of us as a collective are going to be held in collective punishment. And we get lumped in with them. So it becomes our responsibility and our duty to try and get through to these people in any way that we can, and make them realize that they're being lied to and that there's so much more to any situation than what we get on the BBC Evening News.
It does seem that the vast majority of people have something of a predisposition perhaps to go along with the main narrative because it's easier, isn't it? It takes effort to think, to ask questions, and it's dangerous, I think, from their perspective to step away from this sort of nice cozy bubble of the mainstream story where everything, all the answers are given to you. When we step outside of that, we're sort of all of a sudden, oh dear, it's a bit you're kind of on your own, aren't you? Although there's a lot of truth seekers out there, I think the mainstream normies, I think you've referred them to them as maybe a little bit frightened and anxious about stepping outside this mainstream narrative. But it is so important, isn't it? As you've hinted to there already, and it doesn't really. it doesn't really sort of get driven home anymore how important it is than with this pandemic scenario or exercise, as Pompeo has let slip. But yeah, so did you sort of quite easily make the transition? I mean, you obviously saw a lot of the stuff that you've written about in your books about this sort of corruption and the sort of dark forces of control in the music industry, which I suppose you and I would possibly both agree now these sort of tentacles are everywhere, aren't they? Not an awful lot of what we see in the mainstream is as it appears. so you sort of slipped straight into sort of mainstream challenging of this narrative. What's your overall snapshot take of this COVID-19 saga?
Well, it's very difficult to give a definitive answer as to every aspect of the story because there's so much conflicting information out there. There's misinformation, there's disinformation, there's outright lies. What we can be sure of, what we can always be sure of, is that what we're told by the government and the mainstream media is going to be either a complete lie or, to a very large extent, consist of mass deception. And it's clear to see that at the very best, even if there is a virus, and I've got my doubts as to whether there is this killer, deadly virus called COVID-19 out there, but even if there is, we know and we can prove that the figures for cases and deaths have been ridiculously overinflated to make the situation appear more scary than it is and to frighten the worldwide population into compliance with these restrictions that have been introduced. We've got proof that the figures are being fiddled. We've got proof that doctors and nurses in hospitals are being financially incentivized now. Many of them have come forward as whistleblowers, and they've said they've been offered money to put on a death certificate that a person has died of COVID-19. We've got so much proof that people dying of anything, even people in the latter stages of cancer who have been ill for years and would have died anyway, are having their cause of death marked as COVID-19, or it's being put on the sheet that they've tested positive for COVID-19, which is not the same as having died from it. But either way, the perception of how contagious and dangerous this disease is has been hyped out of all proportion systematically and perpetrated by a complicit mainstream media who are merely inflating the official government story on things and doing their bit in getting it out there. So the public is being lied to on a monumental scale, and this situation is clearly being used as justification to bring in all kinds of other totalitarian draconian measures that have been in the plans of the New World Order architects for a very long time. I and many other researchers have been writing and speaking about this stuff for years. We've been warning that it's on the way, but in all honesty, I personally never expected the controllers to throw everything they've got at us all at once. This is not their normal style. Ordinarily, they bring things in incremental steps gradually, and they sneak it in under the radar. They do it as covertly as they can so nobody really notices. And it's not until they're 4 or 5 steps down the line that people usually realize that life now is a little bit different to what it was a few years ago. But they've dumped it all on us at once at the moment. And I've got to ask myself why they're doing this, because to me, it speaks to them panicking that they're running out of time. It speaks to them getting very concerned that large numbers of us, the victims that are in their crosshairs for all this social conditioning, are getting wise to what they're doing. And they're terrified at the exchange of alternative information that's going on through platforms like this and many others like them. Now, clearly, there is a very large proportion of the general public that have yet to be reached with truthful messages. Most of these people still believe everything they see on the evening news and that they read in newspapers. So we're nowhere near the numbers that we need in order to see any kind of effective change. But we're on the way to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you mentioned earlier that people like to stay in their comfort zone, in their bubble, and they just like their creature comforts in life, and if they can have those, they'll turn a blind eye to all kinds of injustice and insanity that's going on elsewhere in the world. But we've now been conditioned to accept this as the new normal. This is one of the mantras that we're getting in the mainstream press. So people are starting to realize that they can't have all the creature comforts that they've taken for granted. You can no longer go to the pub for a pint and a chat with your mates when you want it. You can no longer go out for a coffee in the cafe. You can no longer go on holiday with your family. You can't go to the gym. You can't go to the swimming pool. So all these things that people have taken for granted have suddenly been taken away from us. I think a lot of people are still reeling from the shock. They're like rabbits caught in the headlights. They don't quite know how to act about the whole thing. Clearly, many people are in a state of fear. They're walking around with their masks on. A lot of people aren't leaving the house. I personally know people that are too terrified to leave the house because they think there's this killer virus. I did a video at the weekend which was slightly mocking. It was called How Normies Think. And I was talking about the fact that people really do believe there's this terrifying virus and it's everywhere, and your next door neighbor could give it to you, your mother could give it to you, you could pick it up from a £10 note, you can pick it up from the handles of a shopping trolley. So people are in this fear-based mind state. But there are others who are starting to realize that all is not well in the world and that this situation is very, very strange. And they're wondering how all of our lives could have been changed so radically in such a short period of time. And these are the people we need to try and reach with factual, evidence-based information about how the figures are being cooked up, about how we're being misinformed about the true nature of viruses and how contagious they really are, and about what the ulterior motives are behind these lockdown measures. Because anyone with an ounce of common sense can see that the measures that have been imposed are out of all proportion to the apparent threat, even if the threat were as real as they claim it is. How can you justify trashing the economy of the world? How can you justify forcing people to stay in their homes? How can you justify all the suicides and all the mental health issues that are going to ensue as a result of people being kept in isolation? It's not good for the soul. It's not good for the spirit. It's not good for the mind. There's so much devastation. There's so much suffering that's going on in the wake of this, and it makes no sense. If we had a compassionate government that truly cared about its people, it would isolate and quarantine the most vulnerable members of society, particularly old people or people with underlying health issues, and it would allow everybody else to go about their business, keep the economy going, keep their immune systems fired up, because this is an important thing. The longer people are kept away in their homes and they're not going out and about and their immune system isn't being exposed to all the germs and all the bacteria that exist in everyday society, always have, all through our lives. The immune system is there to put all that stuff down, but it needs to practice. It needs to be kept fired up the whole time. And for as long as we're in isolation, we're not getting that. So none of this makes sense. The regulations just don't stand up to scrutiny to any kind of critical thinker. And thankfully, more and more people with every passing week are starting to realize this.
Well, I do hope that's true. It is an important part of the context, isn't it? And you mentioned this just a moment ago. The fact that most people do struggle to grasp that we're lied to, and they do forget things like recent government lies about weapons of mass destruction, etc., etc. Which boggles me slightly. If there was a village liar, I wouldn't trust him, and I don't think many other people would. So why do we lose that principle when it comes to institutional liars? A very important part of the context to Koch is that we're being spoken to by proven liars, but also proven liars that have no track record of really being interested in our health. When you look at government and big pharma, the sort of tag team there, there's no concern about the dangers of EMFs, no concern about the dangers of amalgam fillings, fluoridated water, poor diet. You could go on and on and on. And now all of a sudden they're really concerned about our health. And another thing which I think is very important, which bugs me greatly when I see the narrative swoop on downstream of the fundamental issue, is the testing. And you mentioned there questioning this whole virus mania. And this is an interesting sort of split, if you like, in the mainstream medical paradigm and what you could call functional or integrative medicine, the some people might call it alternative medicine. The new way of looking at medicine, which is more rational, makes more sense when we're considering things like the microbiome diversity and microbes and how they actually assist us. And this is such a long way away from the mainstream medical paradigm of, one pill for every ill, treating symptoms with drugs, and of course, the great vaccine remedy to keep us all inoculated against disease. So there's a huge context of knowledge which I think the average person perhaps doesn't have. And it's regrettable that most people think you have to be an expert to get your head around this, and you've clearly got your head around it. And I've been studying natural health for a couple of years, and it is all possible to understand. I don't think we need to be experts. But you know what? I think you mentioned the fact that they're throwing everything at us at once, and this has really, really shocked me as well, because I've been getting ready for something like this for about the last 10 years. And it's still, I'm still have a little bit of that rabbit in the headlights, factor going on, because it is jaw dropping, as you say, that we've suddenly lost freedom of movement, freedom of association, freedom of speech is being chiseled away with the infodemic declared by the World Health Organization. But just to address one point specifically, you mentioned, why are they hurrying so much? And there are a few commentators that have said this, and I thought I might just bat it at you, that the economic situation we're in has been sort of mathematically poised to collapse anyway. And there are many commentators suggesting that we are in the process of the early stages of this whole economic system falling down. And what a perfect sort of economic handbrake to pull on with this lockdown, which can, you can justify any kind of economic calamity, any kind of depression or collapse can now squarely be blamed on COVID-19, this alleged virus nonsense. So I suspect strongly that the economic imperative might have something to do with the urgency.
Well, it's evil genius what they've done, isn't it? Because it ticks so many boxes.
Yeah.
They're crashing the economy so that small businesses can't survive. So the only ones that are going to weather the storm are the big multinational corporations, which are all, in the pocket of the New World Order architects. They're demonizing cash. They're trying to get digital currency only. They're trying to make cash seem dirty because it can carry the virus. It's everywhere. And they're trying to bring in the vaccinations now. And I'm absolutely dumbfounded. And I just feel like giving a quadruple facepalm to the news that some people are actually calling for vaccinations. Members of the public are queuing up, can't roll up their sleeves fast enough to get a vaccine which they think is going to protect them from any future strains of this, not realizing that vaccines in themselves are hugely dangerous. Just look at the ingredients in your average vaccine. Not a good idea to put that stuff in your body. It's toxic. The immune system is there to keep stuff out of your body. You're suppressing the immune system by giving it vaccines. Then there's the chipping ID 2020 idea, which is one of these initiatives that have been floated around for a while. The idea is that everybody is digitally chipped in some way to identify themselves, and so that they can integrate with the 5G artificial intelligence smart grid Internet of Things, which is rapidly being rolled out. All these different agendas have been quietly sneaked in over the past few years, and we're starting to see now how they all coalesce and they all come together and they all fit in with each other. And in most cases, Bill Gates seems to be involved. He seems to have his bloody fingers in every pie going. So you've got ID 2020, you've got the so-called COVID-19 pandemic that we all need to be protected against. You've got the 5G rollout, which is going ahead, and this coronavirus situation, so-called, is just being used as an excuse to fast track all this stuff into place. As you said earlier, why would anyone trust the government on this? Why would you trust someone like Bill Gates, who has been presented to us as this Microsoft nerdy computer guy? He's got no background or no qualifications in medicine or health at all, and yet he's dictating to the World Health Organization and the United Nations and various different governments, and giving these people any kind of a second chance when they've been shown to have lied to us time and time again before is rather like a confidence trickster that comes to your front door, knocks on your door, and he says, "Hello, I've got a great investment opportunity. If you give me £1,000, I'm going to put it into this project I've got going, and you're going to make a ton of money." And you go, "Oh, okay, that sounds good. Here's £1,000. The guy disappears. You never hear from him again. You never get your money back. 6 months later, the same guy knocks on your front door and he says, "Hi, I've got a great investment opportunity for you. All I need is £1,000." And you go, "Oh, right, okay, yeah, here's £1,000." You would never do that because the guy scammed you once. Why are you going to give him a second chance? And yet people do this with governments. They do it with the mainstream media. How many times has the BBC lied to us? How many times have the government lied to us? It's what they do. They're professional liars. But so many people still think that they're on our side, they're there to help us, that government ministers and BBC newscasters go into the job because they're just big-hearted and they care and they want to help us. And people like Bill Gates, they just want to help us. It's absolutely incredible. Another thing that's been achieved with this whole narrative is it's made humanity itself, human beings, look like a threat to the future of Earth. We saw this being the framing of the whole climate change agenda last year when Greta Thunberg came out and she was addressing the United Nations. She's an actor, by the way, playing a role. All these people are when you look into who her family is. So she was creating the idea that the climate is heating up, global warming as it's called. And the reason for this is because of us terrible humans driving our cars, taking airplane flights, going about our business. We're the ones polluting the environment. We're the ones destroying the ecosystem. We should be ashamed of ourselves. Now we've got this coronavirus narrative, and it's being framed here that the problem with this whole thing is humans going out and interacting with each other. The problem is humans being social, getting together in public spaces. Also, the problem is air travel, the fact that we freely move around the world. We're told that this whole thing started from a Chinese person eating a bat. And people are actually buying this. And then a few other Chinese people got infected. And then these Chinese people started getting on planes and flying all around the world. And when they got off the plane, wherever they were in the world, they had this virus in them. And it was seeping out of their nostrils and seeping out of every pore and infected the local people. And then that country got out of hand. Everyone's infecting each other. And the idea is that it's humans. We're really bad. And we need to fix up. And this is straight out of the mindset of a eugenicist. Bill Gates is a very well-known eugenicist. These people are all about population reduction and breeding out undesirable traits and elements of the human gene pool, leaving just the more desirable elements, i.e. them and their class, as they see themselves, to procreate their genes. So there's a very dark and dangerous undercurrent to all of this, to anyone that's paying attention.
The fundamental thing that gets me, and this is why I refer to the fact that you don't necessarily need to be an expert to understand the lie and to know that you're being hoodwinked. And if we go right back to the basics, the alleged PCR tests, and there are a couple of presentations out there on YouTube. Or I tried posting one of them actually the other day. It was promptly taken down, so hopefully they remain up a little bit longer. Dr. Thomas Cohen, Dr. Andrew Kaufman, among others, illustrating the protocols that have been published that were used by the Chinese during the process of allegedly identifying said virus and giving it sort of or attributing it as cause, should we say, to this collection of symptoms known as COVID-19, the dry cough, etc., etc., difficulty breathing. And the protocols that they use are incredibly flawed. There's a set of protocols called Koch's Postulates, which some of you may have heard of, which were not satisfied. And these are just basic common sense steps in verifying and proving causality between a microbe and a set of symptoms. Now, this is really, really important. It's right at the beginning of the whole story, because all of the figures, all of the PCR test, all of this stuff comes, it's all downstream of this unproven correlation. There's a correlation. The PCR test, you probably know, Mark, already. The PCR test it identifies RNA, genetic material, as a proxy for the virus. There's no direct, that's it, we've got it. The PCR does not specifically identify any particular virus. I mean, that's massive. And when you then look into these things called exosomes, exosome theory, it's another thing that I recommend people look into. You find that viruses look identical to exosomes, which is very, very interesting. They can't really be distinguished, and yet our bodies produce these exosomes during detoxification and other normal processes of illness. When we have cancer, for example, our body's cancer cells are producing exosomes. So there's a huge grey area of what the PCR test's actually identifying. And if it's just identifying exosomes, and there's no certainty that it isn't, that makes the PCR test, that the vast majority of all the testing done is using the PCR test, it makes it absolute nonsense. And when you add in all the, inflation of the figures that you mentioned earlier, you've got a complete fantasy of projected, bad news, projected sort of epidemic and death. It just doesn't bear any relation to the facts. So the thing that really gets me is this right back to the point one. If you could rewind the whole story right back to the beginning, but of course you can't, because the mainstream narrative has moved on. It's all about how soon can we get the vaccines out. It's all about arguing about PPE equipment or whatever it is. And this lack of questioning of the fundamental start of the whole story in Wuhan. That's one of the things that really gets me. And I think if people could understand the huge gaps in the rational argument that says this is a virus and it's caused these symptoms, that's not been proven. And so, you can't go further downstream and with that being unproven.
Well, you see, you have been able to take on all of that information about exosomes and the true nature of viruses and such without any medical qualifications, right? I'm assuming you're not qualified in medical fields. No. Okay, so you've been able to absorb and recite all that information because you've researched it for yourself. And this is the point. I have too. And you don't have to have any kind of qualification. You don't have to have attended any particular academic institution. You don't have to have letters after your name to be able to do your own research. We live in an age where anyone can research these things if the will is there. You need the will and an internet connection, and that's it. So a lot of people will only take any kind of information from a qualified professional. So if the likes of me tried to speak to the average member of public, they'd say, what do you know? You're just we don't swear on this, do we? You're just an effing DJ.
Yeah.
That's what they would say. They say, what do you know? You're a DJ. How can you know anything about medical subjects? Well, I can research them, and anyone can. So this is what's so valuable about whistleblower doctors that are coming forward, who do have qualifications, who do have letters after their name, who have attended certain institutions, because it's more difficult to argue with what these people say. And understandably, there have been very few of them coming forward. Most of them seem to have been in America as opposed to Britain. But you can understand why more wouldn't come forward. They've got salaries to protect. They've got pensions to protect. They've got families to protect. They don't want to crash their careers. So I am very grateful for those medical professionals who have come forward to question the official line on this and provide people with a different kind of narrative. But still, there are many that just won't take it from them. And it just amazes me how members of the public will place their trust in people that they know nothing about. None of us in the UK actually know Boris Johnson. A lot of people might have fallen for his act, that he's this jolly fellow. He's a bit of a bumbling oaf, but he's quite a nice chap, really, But we don't actually know him. And all these people that give you your information on the BBC Evening News or ITV or whatever it is, we don't know these people. So why would you trust what they're telling you when you know nothing about them? It's the same as somebody that might offer to give you a COVID-19 test. They're giving you a swab in your mouth and in your nostril. You have no idea what's on that swab. You've only got their word for it, that it's all safe and everything's going to be fine. You don't know if they're putting something into you when they're telling you they're taking a test. When somebody comes to vaccinate you, most people don't even think to question what's in the vaccine. They just trust the guy because he's got a white coat on and he's a doctor. And you can trust doctors, right? But it just amazes me that people don't scrutinize things more, particularly when it comes to what's going in their own bodies. It's quite incredible to me.
Yeah, I think, in fact, yours and my lack of official qualifications is our best qualification.
Absolutely. Because we have no ulterior motives, no vested interests, no official line to toe, certainly no financial incentive.
No, I mean, I'm just an ordinary bloke that wants to know what's going on so I can look after my family. I mean, that's my vested interest. I've
I
got
just want to
3
live
kids.
freely and take care of my family. And isn't that what most people want?
Absolutely. So, I mean, Mark, do you think this lockdown, I mean, we're going to hear that this is being recorded on May 5th. We're allegedly going to hear some news from the government at the end of the week about the lockdown. It seems to me it's very difficult to get a feeling of what's going on out there, of course. But do you think that there will be a growing sense of frustration and increasing disbelief? Because, yeah, the rabbit in the headlights moment, there is a shock factor. But as things start to settle in, do you think there's much chance of any kind of backlash? But given a lockdown scenario, and this just boggles me as well, is that our means of protest are severely restricted. There's very, very little we can do. What are your thoughts on the sort of pressure cooker scenario that we're in?
It does disappoint me that the UK has not been more proactive in making a very visual statement about how peed off people are with this lockdown situation. When you look at other countries, in America, there have been demonstrations in various states. I saw a video today about the governor of California apparently backed down on some lockdown measures in the face of protest from people taking it to the streets. We've seen that in Europe, various European countries. I think Poland this last weekend had a bunch of demos. There's been nothing like this in the UK. Last week, there was a small gathering in Glastonbury led by Piers Corbyn, the brother of Jeremy Corbyn, which was very promptly shut down by police. And I hear about 20 people turned up in London on Saturday, and that whole thing was shut down and one man got arrested. And that's a pretty pathetic public response in terms of sending out a message that we do not consent to the taking away of our rights and freedoms. I would have liked to have seen more people taking it to the streets. And people will argue about the effectiveness of protests and demonstrations, and they'll say they never really change anything. But the point is they are sending a message, and they are letting the controllers know that there are some of us who are not happy with this. There are some of us not putting up with it. There are some of us that stand for self-respect and dignity and rights. And we're not just prepared to roll over and have those taken away from us. But in terms of how it's going to pan out, there are various legal cases, I understand, which have been launched against the UK government. I'm aware of 4, where legal experts are planning to take it to the courts to hold the government and individual members, so Boris Johnson personally, Matt Hancock personally, liable for the damage and the harm that has been caused by 6 weeks of lockdown. So maybe that's the only way to get through in this country. If the demos aren't going to cut it, then maybe it needs to go into the courts. Again, people will argue the effectiveness of that process. But something has to indicate that there is a large percentage of the population that's not happy about this. And we don't just want to wait until we're given permission by our overlords to go out of our houses and resume our businesses and resume our lifestyles again. From what I've seen, there are going to be a large number of people who are going to be too frightened to go out even when the government tells them it's okay, because they've been terrified into compliance and they believe this thing is everywhere and is going to get them. And those people, to be honest, are just beyond salvation and beyond hope if they will buy the lie that easily without doing their own research into it. So they need to be left to cower in fear in their own houses and wear their masks. For everybody else, we just want to get back to as close to normality as we can as quickly as possible, don't we? And that's only going to happen when some of these things are unlocked and we can start going to the pub again, we can start going to restaurants again, we can start going on holiday again. However, I wouldn't underestimate the idea that those of us that have shown some kind of pushback against all this, and those of us that have been sharing alternative information, because you can be sure social media has been very closely monitored through this whole thing. Podcasts and videos and broadcasts have been kept an eye on by those whose job it is to do this kind of thing, to gauge the reaction of people. So it will be clear that there are a faction of us that are wise to what's really going on here. We're not buying the lies. We are capable of doing our own research, and we know what agendas this whole thing is really being used to justify. And we can't underestimate the suggestion that they may have planned to take this whole thing even further, even quicker. but they've been going step by step, and they've been closely monitoring the reaction and working out how much they think they can get away with without their cover being completely blown. So the likes of us that are working every day, and for the last 6 weeks, I've done nothing more because I've been under house arrest. I've had nothing better to do. I've been doing nothing more than putting out information, researching myself, making videos, speaking to people, coming up with ideas to, counter this tyranny in some way. We may be having an effect with this, and we've got to see how it all pans out. But it's possible we may have averted a completely totalitarian situation already by making it as clear as possible that we know what this thing is all about. Yeah. So we've got to keep the effort stepped up. We've got to shout very loudly and not be afraid to, and let those that are watching know that not all of us are prepared to give up our rights and freedoms that easily, and not all of us are as susceptible to mind control and societal programming as they'd like to think we are.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we have got an uphill battle because the propaganda has been so cunning this time, especially bringing in the actions of washing your hands, wearing a mask, standing, avoiding people. I go out around here and I go for a run or something like that, and people sort of like avoid me, and I think, oh no,
they'll jump into an oncoming truck to get away from you.
Yes, I mean these sorts of actions are massively powerful reinforcers of the fundamental premise which people are on, which is there's a dangerous invisible enemy out there. Where is it? It's going to get me, and this is it's a very, very powerful message, and when people start acting in accordance with that message as well, it's not just a message they're hearing. This is what we've been getting for decades, isn't it, in the mainstream narrative, the repetition of lies, the climate emergency nonsense, all of this sort of stuff. But this is actually reinforced with action, which for me means it's going to be a lot harder for people to resist, people that might otherwise have been able to shrug off verbal propaganda. When you start acting on an assumption contained within a false narrative, then you're really on its coattails, as it were. There's no avoiding it. But to come back to your point, I'm heartened to hear that there are 4 legal cases in process, should we say? Because I mean, in terms of what we can do, I think the continuance of rational conversation and dialogue with people is really, really important. It's for some of us, it's the only thing we can do, and we all know how hard that is to reach. If people are definitely sort of don't tell me, I'm not listening, then obviously it's very hard. But where we can, to continue on with the rational conversation. But there's another possible legal avenue that I'm aware of. I was chatting to Darren Diogi just a week or so ago, and there's an organisation called People's Public Trust, which could be used as a vehicle for holding public officials to account. When you mentioned this case, and holding people like Boris Johnson personally liable, I'm not convinced of the mileage of challenging this limited liability thing, because a lot of listeners may be aware that our public servants and people in public life in corporations hide behind this limited liability cloak. It's very difficult to accuse people personally, but nevertheless, I still think it's definitely worth trying. But we can hold them to account according to their own principles and rules. There are 7 principles of public life that are published for all public servants, allegedly, according to Darren and his People's Public Trust, which I'll put a link to below this video. And this is it excited me to hear about a potential solution, either with a lot of people jumping on board to support it financially. There's also the possibility of becoming an observer, which I thought was quite exciting. This would give people a very real reason to not, should we say, break lockdown, but to go out and about on their business, effectively sort of monitoring the performance of public officials. So there was a hint of a small palette of options through that People's Public Trust, which got me interested, because, as you say, our options are severely limited at this time, aren't they?
Yeah. There's also an avenue by way of notices of liability, which gets around this limited liability clause. There's a guy called Kel Washington who's got a an organization called the In Power Movement in the United States. He's done a lot of shows with Crow on his Crow 777 radio show recently. And he gets into how notices of liability tie in with natural law and consent and these kind of spiritual, metaphysical matters. And it's a very complicated process to issue a notice of liability. You've got to know what you're doing. You've got to have studied it. But it basically involves corresponding with a named individual, and they're being held personally liable for the damage that they have caused. They're not hiding behind a company or any kind of organization. It's them as a flesh and blood man or woman being held accountable in creation for their actions. So it's bringing in all these kind of elements, and there are some people I know that are working on the idea of notices of liability. So that's another avenue. But I've been trying everything I can think of the past few weeks, and I've had so much correspondence, an absolute ton of correspondence, particularly since I did that video in my car about 3 weeks ago where I just went on a furious rant. I just lost it, and the anger was ripping through me, and I just tore into this furious rant about people and their behaviors and how easily they're just rolling over and putting up with this stuff. So since then, I get, 200 emails a day probably. It takes me most of the day to go through them. And people are telling me that they've had personal successes in getting through to people in their lives, family, friends, colleagues, people that they never would have imagined would look at alternative takes on things. And they've said that this situation is so strange to people and so surreal, and it's changed their lives in such a major way, particularly people that have lost their livelihoods, they've lost businesses, they've been financially impacted by this. They've got nothing to lose now. Their backs are against the wall. And so they are starting to ask some very big questions about this. And people are telling me they're managing to get through to others, and they're getting them to look at other reasons for these lockdowns. So that's a great thing. Yep. I suggested a measure yesterday on my Facebook that we call this Engage a Normie Week, which is where every one of us that realizes we're being lied to here, and there's so much more to it, pledges to work on one individual in our lives, in our circle of family or friends, that we think would be open to being swayed on this. We all know people who are lost. It doesn't matter if they live to be 1,000. They'll never embrace truth. They'll never see it. The mind control is too heavy. They've already made the decision before they got here on a spirit level to live a life of ignorance. These people need to be left to their own devices. You're just going to waste energy and resources on them. But we all know people that show a spark of potential. And if they could be pointed in the right direction and given the right information, they might just come down on our side and increase the numbers. So yeah, I've suggested it should be Engage a Normie Week, where we all work on that one person.
Great.
And then somebody came up with a really good suggestion yesterday, which is to encourage as many people as possible to ditch their smartphones, because we've had the news of this contact tracking and tracing, which is coming along, and it's going to work by way of apps on smartphones. Now, I've never had a smartphone in my life. I still rock an old school dumbass Nokia, and I'm very happy about it. People have been laughing at me for years. My kids have been saying, "Dad, why do you have that old fashioned phone? Why don't you get a smartphone?" Well, now those of us that resisted getting a smartphone are the smart ones, aren't we? Because we're not going to be tracked and traced by way of an app. So there seems to be a reliance at the moment on people voluntarily downloading this app, and then the government or whoever, I hear GCHQ in Cheltenham is getting involved in this as well, which is supposed to be all about spying and surveillance for the protection of Britain's national interests. So now they're turning on the people of Britain themselves and tracking and tracing them. And this app is supposed to let you know if you've been in close proximity to anyone that's known to have been infected with COVID-19 by way of the Bluetooth connection on your phone. So who knows what parties are now going to be poring over your data and working out where you've been at any given time over the past few weeks, which is an outrageous invasion of our natural right to privacy.
Yeah.
And yet many people seem to be very enthusiastic about this because they've been scared into thinking, oh, I could be infected with it, and I'd quite like to know if I've been in contact with somebody. So they're relying on this. So for people that know better, a really good way of put in a great obstacle in the way of this measure that they want to introduce is by large numbers of people ditching their smartphones and going back to a dumbass old handset from the old days. You can still buy these on eBay and places like that. I know a lot of people find it very convenient to have a smartphone. They run their lives off it. They've got used to that daily habit. Not many people are going to want to give that up, but there might be some that will, in the interests of maintaining their privacy, in the interests of maintaining their right to freedom of movement without it being scrutinized. So ditch your smartphone is another great measure that some people might be encouraged to respond to, because these smartphones now are being used to control and surveil us, and we're starting to see what the real agenda was behind getting them rolled out so enthusiastically these past few years. It's all about tracking and tracing. It's all about tying into the 5G, the facial recognition, the artificial intelligence. All these different strands of the technology are starting to come together, and we're starting to see why they were all introduced at the time they were. It was for this moment. This has been planned for a long time. So we have to do whatever we can to throw a spanner in the works with all this.
I like that. Ditch your smartphone. And what was the other one with the newbie?
Engage
a newbie.
Who's up for the challenge? Ditch
Yeah.
your smartphone. You know, who's big enough and brave enough and mature enough to do this, to say enough. These things are controlling us. Don't have anything with smart in front of it. Smart TV, smart meters, it's all bad. And this is inversion, you see.
Yeah.
The smart people are the ones that don't go for these things. If you get yourself smart technology, it's not very smart. But there's a double meaning to the word smart, because smart is also a verb. Too smart means to recoil from something, from a shock. So if somebody like strikes you, or somebody is going to attack you, you smart from it.
Yeah.
You recoil away from the danger. So I think that's the real meaning behind smart this, smart that, and smart the other.
Great stuff. I think on the just another thing that we can do in terms of our rational conversation is to challenge the whole thinking behind locking down to supposedly flatten the curve, because I don't think there's any rational justification for risking an economy, the economy, very big, very fundamental, versus overloading a healthcare system, which is clearly, to anybody with any brain cells at all, a downstream phenomena after a functioning economy. So we need a functioning economy in order to be able to generate the wealth to, take care of each of ourselves and have a healthcare system. So the idea of not overloading a healthcare system, with these trumped up inflated figures and bullshit computer models from Imperial College and all that sort of stuff, risking the economy to not overload a healthcare system, just
out of proportion.
It doesn't make sense. So on that rational level, I think that there's some mileage there in if there's any good to come out of appealing to our local politicians and so forth, is to say that was a dumbass maneuver, because it doesn't stack up. There's no rational justification to risk the economy, wrecking lives, making people unemployment, suicide.
People's elderly parents are dying in hospitals and quarantine centres, and their sons and daughters can't go and see them to say goodbye. This is heartless. This is inhuman. And yet it's coming from a government that claims to care about us. They claim to be doing the lockdowns to keep us safe. Who can't see the contradiction here? Keeping people socially isolated is a genius move, isn't it? When you can't assemble and you can't organise anything. It's just ridiculous. All these things just don't stack up if people really believe the government cares about them, if that's really going to fly with people. It's just inhuman. And this has been the basis of these legal cases that I've seen that are being brought. They're arguing that the lockdown has caused more damage, and it's caused more deaths, actually, than it's saved lives, because people are dying from, we don't know how many suicides there have been because we're not getting the figures reported, but the impact of being forced to stay in your home and not being able to have social contact with other people when you're already suffering from anxiety or mental health issues is going to be devastating to large numbers of people.
Absolutely.
It's not good for the immune system, as we said, not getting access to direct sunlight. I mean, I've been out every day, but a lot of people are obeying the rules to the letter and not going out at all. And it's just ridiculous. It's more inversion, what keeps us impervious to disease? Having a good immune system that's properly fired up. What contributes to that? Access to sunlight, access to fresh air, exercise, social contact.
Yeah.
Is an important part of that, seeing your family and friends. And it's just not the same behind a bloody screen. This is more of the conditioning. All these stupid TV ads where you got all these shiny, happy people and they're all holding up their tablets and their phones and hi, mum, and hi, cousin, and all this. And they're cooking Sunday lunch together and sharing recipes together all through a screen. This is not the way we were supposed to live. Human beings need social contact. We are social beings. And they're trying to sell to us that because we could do all this stuff via Skype or Zoom or WhatsApp, it's just as good as being there. It's not. And another thing is, all these ads that we have on our TV now, very professionally produced, aren't they? We're supposed to believe they've been turned around just in the last 3 or 4 weeks. They've got all those actors, they've done all the casting, they've written the scripts, they've got them into the studio, they've filmed it, they've edited it, they've added the graphics, they've mastered it, they've distributed it, all in the course of these past few weeks. To me, it smacks of foreknowledge on the part of many, many organizations and institutions that this was coming. Those ads must have been produced weeks ago.
Yeah.
All these things like the One World concert, curated by Lady Gaga the other weekend, all those rock stars performing from their living rooms, that was supposedly turned around in 3 weeks or something. Doesn't seem very plausible to me when you apply critical thought to it. And also all these shops, these supermarkets, they've all got their nice laminated signage, they've got their bits of tape and their arrows on the floor, they've got their staff wearing t-shirts saying please safe distance 2 meters and all this. They've got the perspex screens on the checkouts that fit just perfectly. Turned all that lot around very quick as well, didn't they? Or is it more likely that the CEOs of Tesco, Sainsbury's, all these other stores knew damn well that this was coming and they had an advance heads up, so they had plenty of time to get all their corporate policies in place, because all these stores are acting in exactly the same way, aren't they? Everyone you go to has got a sign outside saying, we're taking COVID-19 really seriously. We want to keep you safe. Please follow the social distancing rules and keep 2 meters apart. They're all behaving in exactly the same way that governments did. All the governments of the world, with only a few exceptions, a few rogue nations here and there, all went into the very same lockdown measures at the very same time. And we're supposed to believe that these are independent, autonomous governments making their own decisions. It's clear that the order was received from on high, and it came down the chain of command to all these governments, and they were required to take this action at the same time. And I've seen the same thing with all these corporate supermarket chains. It smacks of advanced knowledge. They knew it was coming. They had time to prepare for it. And I just don't buy that they've turned all this signage around and all this corporate policy just in the past few weeks. People might like to think about that one. We know that there are groups like the Bilderberg Group, the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission, and then there's these more secretive social engineering think tanks and mystery schools and secret societies. The movers and shakers of society, business leaders, politicians, banksters, high-profile celebrities, all get together at these gatherings and they plan what is going to be rolled out in the future months and years. So it's pretty obvious to me that at many of these meetings in 2019 and evidently some years before that, all of this stuff was getting planned. They were talking about things like social distancing, self-isolation, all these buzzwords, lockdown. Lockdown is a word that's used in the prison industry to refer to prisoners. Have a think about that. I mean, I've been through every human emotion during the course of this thing. To start with, in the first week, I was probably the same as most people. I was completely bewildered. I didn't know what the hell was happening. I felt like I had no direction in the whole thing. I was in a fear-based state. I was stressed. I was anxious. I had a terrible first week. By the time the second week had rolled around, I'd got more used to the situation. But in the course of every day, I was veering from anxiety, stress, despair to rage and anger and fury at our rights being taken away and at how easily people are just falling for this psyop, to wild optimism and hope. And most days still, I go through all those different emotions during the course of the day. But as the weeks have gone on, we're in week 6 now, I think, or into the 7th week. I've got more and more focused on an optimistic outcome to this, on a positive outcome to this. And I'm focusing my energy on that because I've had my absolute fill of doom and gloom and dread, because I was getting it from the mainstream media. Not that I choose to watch the BBC Evening News or any other, but I'm still getting the stuff filtering through. And I was looking at newspaper headlines once a day just to get a handle on what people were being told, and then leaving it alone. And it was all doom and gloom. And then I would spend the rest of the day on social media or corresponding with other truthers. And I realized I was just getting more doom and gloom and dread. They're just giving doom and gloom and dread of a different variety. So they're saying, this is it now. This is the new world order end game. We're never coming out of lockdown. We're going to be forced to take a vaccine. We're going to be forcibly tracked and chipped and traced. And there's no way out of it. 5G is going to fry us all. And our children don't have a future. This is stuff that does no favors to anyone. It's just going to keep you in a fear-based negative state, in a low vibration. It's likely going to affect your physical health as well as your mental and emotional health. And I decided I'm just not going to listen to that stuff anymore. I'm going to step above it, because the kind of outcome that I want, and I know the kind of outcome that many other people want, is outside of the domain of doom and gloom and dread. We want a positive outcome from all of this. And so I've started making these positive affirmations to creation, to the universe, in terms of what I want to see manifest out of this. So every day now I go for a walk, and I have this quiet time, got some beautiful walks close to where I live. You know, I'm very lucky to be very close to some wonderful nature spots. And as I walk, I make statements out loud to what people would call God, you know, the creative force. And I declare my will and my intent in terms of humanity taking back its freedom, taking back its destiny into its own hands, and for the evildoers behind this narrative who are seeking to control and enslave us all to fail miserably, and for them to be crushed and destroyed, and for them to face the full karmic consequences of their behaviors that they have brought upon themselves. And so I express my will for this to be the case, and I've started encouraging other people to do the same. People might think this sounds a bit new agey, but it's been proven that you can harness the forces of nature, you can harness energy, and you can create a kind of physical manifestation based on your intent that you apply to a situation. The dark occultists that we have running the show, because that's what these people are, the architects of this narrative, the controllers, at their base root core, they are dark occultists, and they adhere to ritualistic behaviors according to their sick, twisted religious belief systems. And you can be sure that they're using magic and sorcery and witchcraft and the harnessing of nature to try and bring about the kind of reaction that they want, the kind of situation they want, which is for us to be completely suppressed and enslaved by them. So we have to recognize in our vast numbers that those forces, those facilities are available to the rest of us to shape and mold into what we want to achieve. And we can overwrite the darkness and the evil that they're planning with thoughts of positivity. I've got this mantra that I've created because I realized that I had all these mainstream media buzzwords going through my head all the time. And I would be trying to get to sleep at night, and all I would have is coronavirus, COVID-19, pandemic, swimming round and round in my head. And so I worked to overwrite those phrases with phrases loaded with positive intent. Truth, freedom, justice, love. That's my new mantra. I chant that every day. Truth, freedom, justice, love. Those words are powerful because they have energetic value to them. They have intent applied to them. So my suggestion, another suggestion, because I've tried to think of everything that people can do to counter what's being done to us. But my suggestion right now is that large numbers of us just focus our will and our intent, and we ask the universe, we ask the creator to facilitate the kind of situation that we want to see manifest, which is the destruction of these plans, the failure of lies, deception, evil, darkness, and for truth, freedom, justice, love to prevail. That, I think, is a very powerful process if enough people get behind it. And what I'm doing right now is trying to encourage people to embrace that. And that's where I'm at. That's where my consciousness is at now. No more doom and gloom for me, just focusing on bringing about that outcome.
Well, thank you so much for that, Mark. I think it's great. A whole bunch of useful insights. I think we've covered to help people get a grip on what's actually going on, and we've actually presented some solutions, which I think is always important. I don't want to wallow in doom and gloom. I must admit I have plunged the depths of despair over the last couple of weeks because
we all have, mate. We all have,
because it is sometimes easy to slip into that shit. This is it. But I do reject that. I'm very much a practical, action, evidence-based kind of guy. But I see value in all ways that we can adjust our mindset to a positive state that can galvanize action, really. And I particularly love the one about ditching the smartphone. I'm going to try and spread that one around.
This is the moment of our lives because the controllers, the evildoers, are throwing everything they've got at us. So this is their moment, as they see it, to lock us down completely. But this is the best opportunity that humanity has ever had to step into its own power and counter these threats to our freedoms and our safety and our rights. And if we don't do it now, we're never going to get the chance again. So this is the moment of our lives. Yeah. 2020 is the year that will decide how the rest of humanity's story plays out from this point forward. And for those of us with kids that are going to have to grow up in this world, it's just not an option for us to fail.
It's that classic, Daddy, what did you do back in 2020 when they locked everyone down? Nothing, son. That isn't an option, is it? It's just not
telling
an option.
Your kids you just sat on your ass and did nothing.
Yeah.
How ashamed are you going to be to have to honestly admit that was you when all this was going on?
Do you have any other suggestions, obviously, Mark, or have we exhausted them?
Well, if you ask me next week, I may, because what I'm seeing is this whole narrative is being written day by day, literally. We don't know what's going to happen from one day to the next. And I don't think the architects of this do either, to be honest with you. I don't think things are going entirely to plan. I think some of their schemes have been scuppered already by action that's been taken by the people. And I just think the situation changes day by day. So we may find next week the narrative has completely shifted. Some more solutions may present themselves then. But right now, I'm just at a place where I refuse to give in to the negativity, and I'm just focusing on the kind of outcome that I want to see manifest.
Well, I'm aware of the time, Mark. In closing, where can people reach more, learn more about you and your gig? Where might they get your book and so forth? Do you want to just give the listeners some details about your stuff?
Sure. Well, I didn't talk at all about my activities as a researcher into the music industry and all the nefarious stuff that goes on there, which is my specialist area of research. So I've put out 2 books, Musical Truth, Volumes 1 and 2, and they break down the true nature of the music industry and what it's really used for, which is, for the most part, for mind control, social engineering, and programming people with certain ideas and certain values. And we've seen aspects of what goes on in the music industry crossing over into this current narrative with what I refer to as lifetime actors. These are people who are placed in the public eye, so everyone's familiar with them. They're celebrities, they're household names, and you think they're just musicians or actors or politicians or whatever, but their true nature is to prop up whatever elite agendas are being propagated at the time. So whenever they're needed, they're pushed out there to be the public face of one of these things. And so we've seen that with the One World concert of the other week. Paul McCartney's there and Elton John's there and Mick Jagger's there, all these tired old names that have been around for decades. They've had their careers gifted to them. They've been allowed success and fame and fortune, but it's come at a price. And part of that price is whenever they're called on to do a bit of extracurricular work, they have to do it. So I think we're seeing how the work of lifetime actors ties into things like this current coronavirus situation. So I talk about all that in my books. They're both available on Amazon If anyone would like to get copies from me direct, though, I can mail them out, signed copies in the UK. There's no mail leaving the UK at the moment, apparently, because the planes have all been grounded. So if anyone wants to get one from within the UK, they're welcome to drop me an email at markdevlinuk@gmail.com. I've also got an allegorical novel, which I've just put out, called The Cause and the Cure, which is quite a prophetic title in the circumstances. And I've got copies of that available too. My YouTube channel, where I've got many of my public talks and lectures, many of my radio interviews, and a whole load of other stuff. My rant video is on there. That's at youtube.com/MarkDevlinTV. And I'm on Facebook and Twitter and Blogspot as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to share your perspective and all your insights, Mark. Really appreciate that today.
Thanks,
And I hope you've got some value from this, everybody listening. And I urge you to visit the website, lawfulrebel.com. There's loads more there, useful information, helping you to take control of your life and thrive. And I do hope you'll join us again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.
Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see.